Debra Cagan worked as a career State Department diplomat and Defense Department official from Reagan to Trump administrations, including senior director for European, Russian, and Eurasian security issues. So anyway, that's the official bio. But actually, in talking to Debra and reading her bio, Debra, you are extremely experienced both in the Middle East and in Russia. You participated in negotiating with the Russians and getting rid of nuclear materials. You have an incredible background. So thank you for joining me. It's an honor to talk to you.
Thank you for having me.
Let me first, if you don't mind, ask you about China and Russia, and watching these meetings over the last 2 days with President Xi and President Putin. From what we've seen of them, it sends a chill for me in some way, because I feel like that something is being set in motion, that this alliance between the two is really against the West, is getting stronger and gaining momentum, and it seems to be something that should be worrying, all of us. Would you agree?
Well, I want to, if I can push, go a little backwards here. The first I'd like to say is that China actually creates things, Russia creates nothing. And so they have different approaches to how to do this. China has its Belt and Road Initiative, which I, as a Chicagoan, compare to the mafia kneecapping people, sort of, we'll give you this money to do this. We know you can't ever repay us. And once you do that,
But once you take the money,
right, we'll just expropriate
you owe
the
me.
property.
You owe us,
Yeah,
right?
we're not going to blow it up. We're just going to take it from you. We're going to own your port facility, like they've done in Ethiopia and places in West Africa, etc.
Yeah.
So for Russia, Russia has always been much more destructive everywhere they've gone. I mean, my view is China would like to turn Taiwan into the chip maker for the world, and China would like to turn Hong Kong into its own Wall Street. It doesn't want to flatten them, because then it has no benefit for China. Russia just destroys, and they don't care about what happens from that. So they have two different approaches. The second thing that I think makes them less of an alliance that people think they are is that China has a real problem with Putin's use of nuclear threats. China is heavily dependent on its nuclear power status as being a threat to countries that would dare cross it. And if Russia were to use a tactical nuclear weapon and Armageddon did not ensue, that would undercut China's nuclear deterrence strategy. It would undercut Iran. It would undercut India, Pakistan, and all these other countries in the global south who would sort of say, oh, the world did not come to an end because you used a dirty tactical weapon, which is what it would be. So I think there are some disagreements here. What would have been interesting to come out of this joint press conference is if China had made any decisions on supplying arms, serious arms and equipment to Russia. Now, we do believe China's been supplying computer chips, and we all know that modern militaries are chip dependent. Even a small Javelin has 32 chips in it. So China has been helping Russia source the rare earth minerals as well as the components to deliver chips so Russia's supply lines can keep producing weapons. And that to me is it's not as obvious, but it's as insidious as if they were providing the weapons themselves. But I don't read into this long-term alliance, because eventually their interests, their enlightened self-interests, are going to part company in some places. And already some of this is clear in Central Asia, particularly in Tajikistan and the like.
How are they going to part company in Tajikistan, for instance? I mean,
yeah,
you feel that China will use Russia to a certain point and then push it aside because it wants to control those areas?
Yeah, I think China, I mean, Russia has already ceded some of those borders to China. It just doesn't have the manpower to have them as much as it would like. But I do think there was a reason why Russia, for the first 6 to 8 months of this war, was not pulling some of its most sophisticated weapons that it kept in the Far East into use in Ukraine. That's changing now, but it was a long time coming, because I think Russia still saw China as a threat in the Pacific. And not, I mean, we use this term that I don't like, we call our enemies strategic competitors. I'm a big believer in semantics. They're your enemies. Get over it, deal with it. They think you're their enemy. They get a vote. So let's deal with it. But Russia still sees China as, as a, more than an anathema. It sees it as an issue for its own desires to be a Pacific power.
And there are great fears within Russia, and always have been, that eventually China will take over the Far East of Russia.
There was a Russian, in the days when Russian had a lot of five-star generals, there was a Russian five-star back in the 90s who I asked whether you would ever go to war with China, and he goes, on day one, we kill 50 million people. On day two, 70, 100 million. And by day seven, he said on day seven, they'd win because they just have more manpower, more strength, huge industrial complex. And it was very interesting that this five-star wizened general who had, served many tours in many places in the world was that upfront about saying it.
Talk to me about the nuclear threat, because I know you don't feel that Russia would push the button when it comes to Ukraine. And, this week even, you have Dmitry Medvedev, who was the stand-in president for President Putin, who talked about he's talked about using nukes before many times, maybe after his late night vodka sessions, but he certainly talked about it. And then this week, after the International Criminal Court in The Hague indicted President Putin and want to put him on trial for war crimes, here you have Medvedev saying, let's strike The Hague with a missile. Do you take some of these threats to use nuclear weapons as a psychological attempt to put the West off, not to go deeper into Ukraine and get further involved, or do you take them seriously?
I don't take them seriously. What I do think, though, that they are very serious in that I believe the White House and a number of Western governments actually have bought into this Russian narrative that Ukraine going into Crimea is a red line. And it's a red line that'll lead to nuclear escalation. So I think Putin has been extremely successful, along with his sidekicks like Medvedev and Yuri Yushakov and the like, to threaten this, because there are a number of countries who believe that this will happen, and therefore they'll have to respond. Now, I don't take it as seriously because I do believe that countries like China, Iran, India, Pakistan depend very heavily on them being nuclear powers to threaten their neighbors. It's this uneasy peace over Kashmir for India and Pakistan and the like. And for China, being able to be this sort of bulldozer in the Indo-Pacific, it's backing that up with its strong nuclear power status. But were Russia to use a tactical nuclear weapon and Armageddon did not ensue, and the war went on anyway, it would undercut seriously this concept of deterrent strategy that those other countries and this global South has been counting on for a really long time. And it would be showing the emperor has no clothes. And I'll take it a step further. There have been tactical nuclear weapons sitting in Kaliningrad for decades. They were the SS-21s, then the SS-23s, and now the Iskanders. And Poland and Lithuania have had to live in that neighborhood for a very long time. And so this isn't new. I mean, people are looking at this as if this tactical nuclear weapons threat is new. If you talk to the Poles and the Lithuanians, they'll raise their hands and go, no, this is something we deal with every day. And I'll be honest, I don't think Western intelligence on whether those Iskanders have a nuclear warhead on top of them is very good, because most Russian tactical weapons are triple capable. They can carry conventional, chem bio, or nuclear warheads. And I think, other than seeing there's certain sheds that carry this kind of sensitive stuff, we don't know on any given day whether those Iskanders sitting in Kaliningrad have a nuclear warhead on their top. Now, having said all that, if you're a commander in the battlefield and Putin says, I want you to use an Iskander, I want you to use a tactical nuclear weapon here, I'm thinking that if I'm that military, and I'm very skeptical of what Putin's ordering me to do, and I'm going, really, you want me to go use this and then march into a dirty battle space so I can drop dead in 3.5 seconds? So it's not Putin who's going to be pushing that button like on a strategic strike. It is a military commander on the ground who's going to have to deploy that and then have to deal with the fallout of that weapon in what I like to call a dirty battle space. And it's going to be worse than Zaporizhia, making your guys march in there. And that's what you're talking about. And I think that commander is going to blow back and say, I have a conventional weapon that'll give me the same outcome here. Why am I using a tactical nuclear weapon that's just going to kill my guys and not have that much of an effect on the Ukrainian military? So I'm looking at this perhaps a little too logically, but that's how I see this playing out.
No, I appreciate your sensibilities, and I completely pray that you're right on this. So tell me your read on, Putin standing next to Xi, who has said that part of the Chinese are neutral, that they want to have dialogue to end the war, and part of that is this peace proposal that they laid out some time ago, which talks about protecting nuclear power plants, not using nuclear weapons. And President Putin says today, by the way, we have understood just while I was meeting with President Xi, that Britain has declared the delivery of tanks, but also with shells, which have enriched uranium. Quote, if this happens, Russia will be forced to react. Accordingly, the West is now using a weapon with a nuclear component, unquote. Now, I understand that these shells are armor-piercing shells. They are not nuclear shells. They're not nuclear weapons. But even still, the Russians are suggesting this would be the use of a dirty nuclear bomb, or a dirty bomb, not nuclear, and that they would react. Is that not a threat? Another threat from President Putin today?
Yeah, I think Putin's is doing what he always does, which is creating a false flag narrative. So the challengers, the British tanks that they're supplying to Ukraine, like many tanks in many conflicts, use depleted uranium rounds. This is not the same as 19.9% enriched uranium, which is what the threshold is from low enriched to highly enriched uranium. So it's a ridiculous argument, but probably has enough people who don't know what kind of rounds the British are talking about and don't know enough of this. And in the United States, as well as elsewhere in the West and in the global South, you have people who will listen to Putin and go, oh my God, oh my God, oh my God, this is terrible. When in effect, the rounds that they're talking about are depleted uranium rounds. We have used these in the West in conflicts for a very long time, as have Russia. They have nothing to do with enriched uranium. By the way, the standard for enriched uranium for a commercial nuclear reactor is 4.4%, and depleted uranium rounds aren't there. So I'm just pointing this out. So you're not talking about anything that delivers any sort of highly enriched uranium or even low enriched uranium at a level that that is even remotely with yellow cake, for example. So this is Putin conflating a story and a narrative in order to try to justify, if I use nuclear weapons, it's because the West has forced me to, because they're now introducing this stuff into the battlefield and it's their fault. And I think anyone who buys
he's not, sorry to jump in, he's not threatening, but he's saying that in front of President Xi to say what we're not the bad guys. It's the West that is bringing this stuff to the battlefield.
It's not just to President Xi. It's being broadcast globally. It's to say, look, if I'm forced to do this, it's because the West forced me to do this because they use nukes first, and that is not what these rounds are at all. And I'm sorry to be too specific on this, but I think knowing enrichment levels is a good thing, because it allows you to be a little smarter than listening to his stuff on this.
Well, I know in being in many a battlefield, we were told if there's an exploded tank there with a possible round that with one of these rounds, then you better not to go and play on the tank.
Yeah.
But it's not. You don't have to don your gas mask. you said something just before the war started, and I looked at it. Ukraine doesn't have to win against the Russians, you just got to make it hurt. The reality is that an invasion by Russia will result in a long drawn out conflict. That's the credible deterrent. Now, here we are more than a year later. It didn't deter, maybe because they just didn't buy that it would be a long drawn out conflict. They didn't understand that. But if that didn't deter them, I mean, what would?
You know, there's an old saying that many of my military colleagues like to say that military officers learn in their first year in any war college, which is that in order to actually deter an enemy from doing something, you actually have to have those weapons, that offense on the ground in order to deter them. And, you know, when I said that, I foolishly thought we would move much more quickly to arm Ukraine, to make it be that porcupine that no one wants to attack. And that did not happen. Instead, we got incrementalism. So I think, and we still have incrementalism in many ways. You know, a week before the war, we were not going to give them Javelin. You know, and then we gave them Javelin. And this has been this water torture approach to arming Ukraine. So I think what happened here is, as long as we did not go all out in giving Ukraine what it needed to have an effective deterrent, you know, your enemy's not going to stop if they don't think you have the stuff to stop them. Because we've used incrementalism, the Russians still think they have a chance. So in other words, even today, we're denying Ukraine long-range fires like ATACMS, and we're denying them UASs like Reaper, and which is now all of a sudden very famous, like Reaper and its army equivalent, the Gray Eagle.
This was the drone that was shot, that was forced down by the Russians in the Black Sea.
Correct. And we are denying them multi-domain aircraft as well, you know. And the way to take back places like Crimea, the way to assume Ukraine's sovereignty over all of Ukraine, is to actually give them the equipment to attack the Russians where they're living. And they're living in occupied Crimea. They've taken over Sevastopol, and many of their fires that they are shooting at Ukrainian civilians, at hospitals, at critical civilian infrastructure, are being done from that port, are being done from ships. Initially, the two control centers for the Iranian drones were being launched from Crimea. And so, and every time the West gave Ukraine something that could reach a little deeper, the Russians just moved it, you know, 25 kilometers out of the range. You know, they read the newspapers, they know what's going on, they listen to you, and that's what they've done. And so the incrementalism is what keeps the Russian going, because the Russians now believe that the red lines that they have established, meaning that, you know, if Ukraine comes into Crimea, that's a red line. Unfortunately, a number of Western governments, including my own, seem to be buying into those Russian red lines about Crimea. And if you're not going to give Ukraine the weapons that it needs to actually deter Russia, it's not going to happen. So my view is this war could be won this year, but it's not going to be won if you don't give them the equipment they need to stop Russia from using Crimea as a safe haven in which to launch on the rest of Ukraine.
So do you think that the Biden administration is suddenly going to give them ATACMS and let them go for Crimea? I mean, or do you think that it's going to continue to be this slow drip, and that leads us where?
So I think two things. There's always been a host of reasons given on this, and so I'm going to go back to the technical ones first. Initially, it was they'll never be able to use the HIMARS and ATACMS. Well, their success rate with HIMARS using the Gimlers and the small diameter bombs was, you know, over 80%, which is certainly higher than most of our troops were able to accomplish in you know, Iraq, Afghanistan, Syria, etc. Then there was the excuse that we don't want them targeting Russia with these excessive ranges. And then that excuse morphed into a couple weeks ago, if we don't have enough to give you because we're not making enough of them, we don't have enough without deterring the readiness of our own active duty units. And then it came back to a political decision. Because for a really long time, the reluctance to give them the Reaper and the Gray Eagle was tied to an operational security decision. So, as we know, both the Pentagon and the White House came out and said the Reaper that Russia took down was wiped clean of all serious sensitive information. My question then was, okay, if that's the case, there goes your operational security reason for not giving Ukraine the Reaper. Because if you can wipe it clean now, you can wipe it clean if it was shot down by Russia in Crimea, for example.
Okay, so are these excuses?
I think they are excuses. I think the bottom line is a political one. I think the Biden administration is afraid not just of escalation, but my personal view is they're afraid of what happens when Russia loses and Ukraine wins. They, instead of seizing this initiative of understanding Russia can lose and seeing what that future might hold, and something we went through in the 90s, and there were smart people who learned to seize that initiative, we're now sitting here with a great deal of angst over what happens when Russia loses. And I think that, to me, is more of the reason than just plain escalation. I think that there's not a lot of good strategic thinking going on, okay, Russia can lose, and let's let Russia have that problem to deal with. And instead, there's a real fear there. That's just my view.
Debra Cagan, so interesting to talk to you. Thank you so much for your time. I hope we can do this again.
Right. Thank you.